Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining the APN Digital Summit. We hope you've enjoyed the presentation so far. Before we get started with our presentation, we want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, this session is being recorded. We will send you the recording when the presentation is over, along with the additional information to help you continue learning more about these services. If you do have questions during the presentation, please add them to the question window. We will do our best to answer all the questions as they come in, but if we don't, we will follow up in an email after. If you're having any audio issues, try using your computer's mic and speakers. This usually fixes the problem. Thank you again for your time today. I am now going to pass it over to our presenter.
Hello, and welcome to Building SaaS Solutions with AWS PrivateLink. My name's Todd Golding, and I'm a Partner Solutions Architect at AWS, and I'm part of a SaaS factory team. And this team is essentially focused on helping partners that are in all phases of adopting SaaS on top of AWS. We have technical resources, we have business resources, and we can help with optimization or migration or whatever phase of development you're in. And today we're really looking at how PrivateLink is especially helpful to SaaS providers. And there's this real natural intersection between sort of the integration models and patterns we see with SaaS providers and the capabilities that are enabled by AWS PrivateLink. Now, PrivateLink certainly has lots of uses beyond the scope of SaaS and applies to ISVs and applies for any kind of integration pattern that you might be looking at, especially if you're looking to sort of stay within the AWS network. But SaaS is a particularly compelling scenario, so we're going to dig into that aspect of the PrivateLink integration and expect that a lot of what we talk about will apply to more general cases. Also, it's important to note here that we're not going to dig into the weeds of PrivateLink and how it's implemented. The goal really here is just give you a sense of like how it's used and how it brings value in these SaaS environments. Now, before we start digging into the specifics of PrivateLink and how PrivateLink is used to support integrations, I really just want to take a step back and look at the landscape of SaaS integrations and how SaaS providers and SaaS customers are integrating today and what that model looks like. And in this diagram, you'll see on the left-hand side, I have a set of SaaS customers. These could be ISVs, these could be on-premises solutions, they could be any number of different solutions that have a need or an interest in leveraging a SaaS provider. And then on the right-hand side, I have a set of SaaS products here. So these are the actual SaaS providers. They have a SaaS multi-tenant solution that exposes some kind of integration model, right? So, and this integration model typically takes the form of some kind of API. There's certainly other modes of integration. But fundamentally, they say, hey, if you want to integrate and you want to programmatically interact with our environment, we'll expose a public API. We'll secure it as best we can with API keys and other models for securing APIs. And then we'll let these SaaS customers on the left-hand side integrate with that model. And in this integration model typically means that both sides of this have to sort of accept the fact that they'll be using the internet as the mode of integration here. So this means that as customers integrate with these SaaS products, their integrations will cross the public internet to interact with these different SaaS products. Now, for some customers and for some SaaS providers, this idea that you're crossing the public internet is not always ideal, right? Especially mostly here on the SaaS customer side of this. You're in a particular domain or environment where compliance is super important to you. You may have reservations about integrating with some SaaS provider via the public internet. Now, there's certainly alternatives here. Certainly if you're in the AWS network itself, you might look at VPC peering, or you might look at VPN or other bits. But in general, the common mode of integration that happens here is via the public internet. Now, beyond this sort of just basic idea of integration, we also find that SaaS providers themselves, as part of building their systems, also end up with a flavor of integration they have to deal with. So we often in the SaaS factory talk to SaaS providers about the need to really focus on their IP and leverage other partner solutions to really accelerate their development, but also push the responsibility for these common concerns to other products that are advancing and innovating already on their own. So in this diagram, for example, you'll see here I have identity, management and monitoring, analytics, billing and metering. These are all sort of core concepts that are very common to SaaS environments. And there are also areas where there are third-party solutions that fill these gaps very frequently. And so now if we look at this sort of integration sort of story we're talking about, if I want to integrate, for example, as a SaaS provider with a management and monitoring experience, I'm in this same mode of, am I going to cross the public internet as part of that integration? Or if I want to leverage an identity provider, am I going to cross that public internet? So even for the SaaS providers themselves, they may be looking at other SaaS solutions or other third-party solutions that are part of their offering where they have to cross this public internet boundary. And obviously in that scenario, they would ideally like to have this be a more secure integration and not be crossing the public internet if they didn't have to. The last piece of this and the last flavor of integration that I want to talk about is this one that's more about sort of extending the functionality of a solution. So in this particular example, I've taken an e-commerce solution, and you can imagine in an e-commerce solution, I have to do all kinds of compartmentalized functionality here. So I have payment processing, I have chat support, I have fulfillment as examples here. And these are all examples where myself as an e-commerce provider, I may want to, instead of building these bits myself, I may want to rely on a third party for these different capabilities. So fulfillment be a great example of that, where I may want to create a relationship with a third-party vendor who handles all my fulfillment capabilities, and I want to sort of build that and white label that and make that a core part of my solution, or the chat support part of my application. I want that just to appear to be an integrated capability of my solution. And yet I'm going to achieve these integrations and these extensions of my functionality by some kind of API or some kind of interaction with these vendors that are providing these different capabilities to me. So this is yet another example where we would rely on some kind of over-the-internet integration traditionally to achieve this extension of the capabilities of our platform. So we really end up with sort of three basic themes here, right? Which was just general integration between a customer environment and a SaaS provider, but then the SaaS provider themselves wanting to integrate with these bits for management, monitoring, and analytics, and then this notion of sort of extending the functionality of your core product. And these probably all overlap to some degree, and they probably aren't the only patterns that are out there, but they're the common patterns and problems I see that SaaS providers are looking at as they're thinking about how can they sort of integrate with these environments and create the best integration model that they can. So it's pretty clear that there's some really common patterns for integration here, where the need to cross the public internet really introduces some challenge for SaaS providers. The obvious one on this list, the one we talked about a bunch here, is this notion of security. Obviously, anytime I have an integration model where I have to cross a public boundary, there are going to be domains or regulatory or compliance requirements that might discourage me from integrating in those environments. And we really see this as a common pattern where SaaS providers are very interested in acquiring a new customer, and that customer has regulatory or compliance or just general security concerns that make it difficult for them to acquire that customer just because they're not willing to cross that public internet boundary for their integration. In fact, we'll see scenarios where customers will offer an on-premises version of their product just to overcome these challenges. So that's clearly a huge part of this. Now, to a lesser degree, we'll see performance can be a little bit of an issue here. We'll see that some people are concerned about the latency and the performance of crossing the public internet. I think there's some debate around that, but I do see it as a real concern that people raise. And then there's this notion of just onboarding and the complexity of what it means to bring a new integration on board, right? And in general, in SaaS environments, we like to keep everything as frictionless as we possibly can. And so here, as we create each of these integrations, we'd like this to be as simple a process as it possibly can, right? Where somebody can create these connections and create these integrations and as a frictionless a model as they possibly can. The other area that we really haven't touched on, but we'll get into here, is there's also this notion of on-premises integration, right? How do I take my on-premises solution that I have right now today and leverage and integrate with SaaS environments? And how can I do that in a way that I don't have to cross this public internet boundary? So we'll look at how to solve that one as well. And then the last one of this list, discoverability, might be a little bit more forward-looking. But my belief is that as people create more and more of these integrations with PrivateLink, they're also going to have a higher degree of interest in making their products more visible and making it easier for others to find out about these integrations. So today, I think there's not really a great model for discoverability. There's not a way for a SaaS provider to say, hey, I'm a management monitoring solution. You can come find me. You can find out that I have this integration model that exists and onboard me as quickly as possible. So I feel like as this sort of gets momentum, that this notion of discoverability will become more and more important. At this point, you probably have a pretty good sense of the challenges and the kind of models of integration that SaaS providers are trying to achieve and the obstacles associated with them. Now let's turn our attention to how PrivateLink sort of directly addresses these problems. And really the model that it uses is pretty straightforward, right? So we have this idea that we have SaaS customers, as we mentioned earlier, that are running on the AWS network, and their solutions are there. They might be ISVs, they might be custom apps, whatever they happen to be running over here. And that we said that these customers had some need to integrate with these SaaS providers, or potentially SaaS providers want to acquire this customer potentially. And we said really the only mechanism we had here was this notion of using sort of public internet constructs, internet gateway, so on, right? And what we really want to be able to say here is, how can I somehow create a connection between these customers and these providers that has a much higher security footprint to it, right? It has a much more native feel to the integration to it. And this is exactly where PrivateLink comes in. So PrivateLink essentially lets us create this private integration between these products and these customers, right? So I really can go in and configure and use this PrivateLink networking construct to create these very secure connections between the individual products and the customers. And at the core of this integration, at the core of this whole concept, and probably the most important to me element of PrivateLink, is this idea that when I create these private integrations, that they are all achieved within the AWS network. So if my customers are in the network and my SaaS providers are within the network, I want these integrations to be achieved in a way that never leaves the AWS network. Because if I stay within the AWS network, now I inherit all the goodness that comes with being on the AWS network. I get the compliance and the regulatory. I get even the performance to some degree. I get all that goodness that comes within that, within being within that AWS network. And you can imagine now when I go out as a SaaS provider to a customer, or a customer to a SaaS provider in the other direction, and I'm looking for who can I integrate with. If I've offered them this private integration model and I offer them this on the AWS network kind of integration model, they're going to be a lot less concerned about some of the issues they would have if they were crossing the public internet boundary. At this point, you have a pretty good sense of the concepts of PrivateLink and this idea that we can somehow create this private integration. But we don't really have a good sense of what it means to land that inside the AWS networking constructs. And so what we do here is just look at a scenario where between a consumer and provider application and give you a better sense of how the network elements of this sort of come together. So on the left-hand side, you'll see that I have a consumer application. This application is running in its own VPC, has its own CIDR block, And then on the right-hand side, we have some SaaS provider application services, right? So microservices or some kind of functionality that provider is exposing via an API. And that, of course, environment is running in its own VPC. And now we're going to go configure PrivateLink to create this private integration between the consumer and the provider application. And when we go and configure that integration between them, ultimately what will happen here is PrivateLink will assign a private IP address to the provider application services that comes from the CIDR block range for the consumer application. And the net effect of this is essentially that the provider application services begins to look like a native service to the consumer application. It looks like one more service with one more addressable IP address inside of its VPC. So the fact that it lives in another VPC is all transparent to you, and you get this very seamless integration that looks very much like a native integration. Now, if we go a bit deeper than that and say, well, what does that actually look like in more detail? You'll see now, if we look at the left-hand side of this in the consumer and we see our VPC here, what we see is that PrivateLink introduces this idea of a VPC endpoint into the consumer's VPC. And this endpoint gets this IP address that we talk about. And again, this IP address lives inside the consumer VPC, which is a key concept here. Now, that endpoint then talks to a network load balancer and connects to a network load balancer that is running in the provider's VPC. And then this load balancer is essentially balancing across the different services or capabilities that you have exposed as a SaaS provider via your API or so on. So it's load balancing, say, a series of microservices or so on here. So the nice part of this is gone is the internet gateway, the NAT, any NAT devices, any need for peering or VPN. Instead, you simply hit the VPC endpoint with that IP address that's in your consumer VPC, and then it will take care of connecting to the load balancer, and all of that happens sort of fairly transparently to you. And then the nice part of this is you can actually then attach other security constructs to this. So in this example, you could, for example, connect security groups to this endpoint in a way that you could control the flow of traffic through that endpoint as well. But ultimately, this is sort of the landscape of PrivateLink, and these are the core networking constructs that are used to bring it all together. And essentially this idea that this VPC endpoint can live right in your consumer VPC and give you an IP address in that consumer VPC is, to me, the sort of secret sauce and the power of PrivateLink. So the solutions we've talked about so far, they mostly focus on an environment where both the consumer and the provider are both running on the AWS network. However, we also talked about the need to handle scenarios where some or part of an application or an entirely different solution is running on premises and still wants to sort of take advantage of the value proposition of PrivateLink and connect to services that are running on AWS. And so here in this model, you'll see on the right-hand side, once again, I've got these provider application services that are being exposed, presumably through some API that I want to connect to from my on-premises environment. So in this case, I'll set up a direct connection and I will connect that to a consumer VPC. And then that consumer VPC will use its PrivateLink connection, just as we've described before, to integrate with these application services. And this can be a very powerful construct for environments maybe where you just want to leverage a provider solution from on-premises, or maybe you're even in a migration mode where part of your application is still running on-premises and part of your application is running in the cloud. And in that interim, you're using PrivateLink here in this model as your integration mechanism. Now, at the top, we also talked about this need for SaaS providers to integrate with other solutions that were fundamental to their SaaS platform. So we talked about billing and metering and analytics and how how SaaS providers could lean on third parties to fill this void, and how using PrivateLink would be a natural opportunity here to integrate with any one of these third-party products. Because by using PrivateLink to integrate with billing or metering or anything else, you'd get all the goodness of PrivateLink in that it would look like a native component in your environment, but also you'd get to be able to stay on the AWS network. Now I took one example of this and then imagined a possible future where SaaS billing providers might leverage this scheme. So here on the left-hand side is some SaaS provider. They've built a SaaS solution, and like many SaaS solutions, they've decided that they want to use some third-party billing service. So here's Zora, ChargeBeat, whoever. They want to use one of those, and they want to integrate with it with PrivateLink because that represents sort of the logical integration and the best integration model that they could achieve. And you could just implement this where you just implemented a PrivateLink connection, say to Zuora from your SaaS provider, and be done. And then I sort of imagined a slightly more advanced version of this where you might introduce this notion of a billing broker between the billing providers and the actual SaaS provider, where this billing broker represented a superset of the capabilities of these billing providers. And then you really could say each one of these billing providers, if they were to comply with that billing broker's model, could become pluggable into any number of SaaS providers. And so basically the idea here would be if you were compliant with a billing broker model and you were compliant with PrivateLink, any SaaS provider could just come along, and as long as they were plugged into that billing broker, they could use any one of the PrivateLink enabled billing providers. And I think that's a little bit idealistic and a little bit forward looking, but it does to me look like a model that could have ultimately valuable to SaaS providers who want to promote adoption of their solutions and streamline adoption of their solutions. So A, they would build a PrivateLink enabled version of their product, and B, if they could, comply with some standard sort of interface model, but then would make them interchangeable with other products. At a minimum, even if you choose not to use the billing broker model, you definitely would want to be using some kind of PrivateLink connection here to integrate with whichever billing provider you choose. Now, there's another use of PrivateLink for SaaS environments that may not be so obvious. And this has to do with really how you manage and monitor multi-tenant environments. And more specifically, it's used very often in scenarios where I have put each tenant of my SaaS system into its own VPC. In fact, in SaaS and in the SaaS factory, we refer to this as a silo model. Essentially, each tenant has its own stack running in its own VPC here, and there really aren't any shared infrastructure resources. Still a valid SaaS model, but it really usually is sort of created as a result of a need for higher compliance or some regulatory need or some legacy dependency on having tenants be on their own VPC. But in these models, even where each tenant's in their own VPC, we still want to have a very agile sort of management and monitoring experience and a centralized and unified management and monitoring experience. And so somewhere here, we have to create this management service that can interact with each of the tenant VPCs. And of course, we have to think about how can it do that in a secure way and how can it connect to these VPCs. And historically, we've seen this done with VPC peering, and people have to work through IP conflicts and scaling issues there. Or we've seen people just open up ports and try to lock down the paths into these VPCs. None of these have been ideal. Now, PrivateLink, you can imagine, was a great fit for this problem, right? Because now my management service can essentially open a PrivateLink pathway to each one of these VPCs, and I don't have to worry about whether I'm going to have any kind of IP conflicts or anything to do with the network configuration of each one of these individual tenants. And yet I'm still going to get all the goodness of being A, on the AWS network, and B, then getting a better security and performance profile out of all of this. So if you're in one of these environments where you're running separate tenants and separate VPCs, and you're really looking at a really good scheme for centralizing your management, that doesn't impact your networking, I definitely will look at leveraging PrivateLink in this scenario. Now, another sort of dimension of this that is a little bit unusual is how you represent costs in this environment, right? If I'm a SaaS environment and I allow customers to somehow integrate via PrivateLink into my environment, there is some nominal cost here for the actual PrivateLink connection. And as a provider, you have to really decide what's the model I want to adopt. There is not necessarily a sort of blanket case that would cover all scenarios here. It really does depend on the domain and the business model of your application. For some environments, the cost of that connection might be shared with the customer or distributed entirely to the customer. And other scenarios, the SaaS provider might choose to say, I'm going to hide all those details away. That's just baked into the cost of my product. And as they create these individual connections, I won't pass through any of that cost to the customer. Both are valid. My main point here would be you don't want to overlook this as part of your adoption model. You definitely have to decide how you want to allocate these costs and who should own the responsibility for them. So we just want to look at and sort of sum up some of the core advantages here. Hopefully they all already stand out, but I thought it would sort of revisit them. Obviously, to the SaaS provider, I believe it's pretty clear there's a much stronger security profile here. So now instead of sort of opening my public API and requiring anybody who integrates with me to go through some public model to integrate with me, I can now let them all stay on the AWS network. And to me, that's a huge advantage in the way I position my product, and it enhances the security story I can tell to the consumers of my API. It also gets me away from this on-premises sort of install model, right? Some people will say, well, yes, we're a SaaS provider, but the only way we can sell to certain businesses is to actually install in their environment. And now this PrivateLink sort of integration raises the security bar enough and raises the compliance bar enough that you can often move away from that model. And that obviously brings you better agility, brings you often cost benefits and so on. The other bit here is marketplace discovery. I think for SaaS providers, this idea of being able to publish my product, put it out in the marketplace, get it badged, and have people to be able to find out about it gives me a real chance to bring new customers to my product that might not otherwise found it, and also bring them to you in a context where they're aware of the fact that you're a PrivateLink enabled product, and that might be a real value add to them. In general, I think that PrivateLink for providers just generally lets you attract new customers, partly for the security reasons we described, and partly just because it's a better integration model probably for many who are already on AWS. So this to me represents a real opportunity to find and bring on board customers you may not be able to access before, either based on their security requirements or based on other constraints. I believe that the overall integration scheme of this is less complex than some of the things that you might have to implement in a public internet environment. It feels like a pretty straightforward model, and the adoption and the learning curve of this seems pretty minimal. So I think the ability to create these connections and be able to take advantage of this doesn't require this massive investment of time. And then finally, this last one under provider benefits is really sort of a standalone one, but it's this idea of being able to manage siloed VPCs, this idea of tenants in each of their own VPCs. This being able to move away from peering and other strategies here and rely on PrivateLink here is super valuable. Now, from the customer side, we certainly have overlapping sort of values here. But if we look at the value of PrivateLink through the lens of the customer, clearly this ability to access with this higher security bar, this notion of private access to the services is very appealing, and it really helps with this whole security and compliance story. We've definitely seen partners who are now onboarding with one another because they are meeting this security and compliance bar via PrivateLink that they couldn't meet before. I do believe that there's also a bit of a performance benefit here for customers. I think just the adjacency of all this is generally going to translate into lower latency. I wouldn't say that's going to be a massive uptick, but in general, I think you will get slightly better performances there. And then finally, for customers, this idea of using direct connect and going through a VPC to connect to your AWS resources and having them sort of having the integration model be so clean and so seamless is going to have a lot of value to customers. So what are the key takeaways here? What are the things that I would hope that you would stick with you after this? Well, overall, I think that PrivateLink just generally changes the security and compliance story for your applications. This idea that you're living on the AWS network and you're inheriting the traits and the characteristics of the AWS network, and in general, you're just not crossing a public boundary, is a huge appeal to those that are wanting to create these integrations. I also believe it's a new model for integrating like the third-party tooling that's part of your own SaaS environment, right? So if I'm building a SaaS solution and I'm wanting to leverage analytics and tooling and all those other bits, that this is the way I would prefer that you lean and promote those integrations. Even if you're doing extensions of the product functionality, but you're achieving those with integration with some kind of third-party product, it's a natural point to lean on PrivateLink and then have this integration where the IP address of that resource looks like it's just in your VPC, and it just creates a more intuitive model to me. Obviously, this generally creates a better way for managing VPCs. I think we talked about that. That's just the PrivateLink connection and as a way to manage these individual environments is a pretty compelling model compared to the other options you have. And just I've already said this, but this notion that you're really consuming these resources through this PrivateLink integration like they're almost like they're native AWS services, right? Instead of this idea that you're very aware of the fact that you're crossing out through the internet gateway and that you're crossing through other boundaries to consume these services, kind of fades away here, and you really start to feel like these things are all just part of your environment. To me, that fundamentally changes the mindset and the programming model. And then finally, the last one here is, to me, this just opens the door for new opportunities, right? New integrations between customers and providers that maybe didn't exist before. We definitely see businesses working with one another that hadn't worked together before. And so hopefully this is growth opportunity for both sides, where you bring more visibility and new integration schemes as a provider, and you get more accessibility through these secure models as a consumer of these environments as well. So I really appreciate you taking the time and listening to this. I know that this is very much a SaaS-focused view of PrivateLink, but hopefully you got a good sense of how PrivateLink can address a number of different scenarios and add a lot of value to this. I definitely encourage you to go dig in and look more carefully at the weeds of what PrivateLink integration really looks like, because I think we just sort of tapped the surface on concepts here. And I also encourage you to go out and look at the SaaS Factory content on AWS. There's lots of best practices and guides out there that will be very helpful to you. Thanks so much. Have a good day.